Every version of us has spent every version of all of our lives in one infinite crib built around an infinite f***ing baby. And I'm leaving it. That's what makes me evil. Being sick of him. If you've ever been sick of him, you've been evil too.
Rick and Morty has had a handful of episodes that have reshaped the show. These episodes changed not only the characters, but the dynamic of the show as a whole, but none of them have ever come anywhere close to the impact of Season 5, Episode 10, Rick, Morty, Jack. Prior to the end of Season 5, the show began to have more episodes with deeper meaning, but up until this point they never truly confronted Rick's past or any significant lore. Since we saw a fabricated version of Rick's backstory in Season 3, it's never been clear how much or how little of it was real at all, and Rick's wife Diane wasn't even mentioned again until Rick, Morty, Jack. Because of this, early Rick and Morty theories had very little to go off since the show hardly ran on any canon and was more than not focused on one-off adventures that didn't have a long-term effect on the show. Seasons 1 through 4 were definitely the show's peak in terms of popularity, however that doesn't mean that those were the best sets of episodes in the series. Early episodes succeeded by having a lot of parallels to existing, popular franchises. I mean, one of the reasons Rick and Morty ever got so popular is because of its reference to pop culture. Almost every episode name is a reference to a show or a movie, and usually one related to the episode. Even the episode I'm talking about today's namesake came from the animated series Samurai Jack on Adult Swim. Inspiration and parodies have always been a part of Rick and Morty's story, and that's where this episode started to change it all. After the finales for Season 1 and Season 2, the next season premiere took place right after the previous season, so a level of continuity has been established for a while now. However, those were all separated by years of development, and the finales of those seasons served as cliffhangers. Meanwhile, Rick, Morty, Jack is actually part of a 2-episode arc that released the same night back in 2021. This was the first and only instance of Rick and Morty having back-to-back episodes with a shared arc in the same season. The arc started with Forgetting Sir Rick Mortshul, which had Rick and Morty getting into a fight that led to them splitting ways and Rick finding a replacement for Morty. Eventually, Rick chooses 2 crows and eventually runs off with them to start a new life as a crow-themed anti-hero. That's basically all you need to know because this guy is irrelevant and is never thought of again. So the much more important part of this arc was the second episode, Rick, Morty, Jack, which started off with Rick, who became fully into his life as Crow Rick, taking out anyone who stands against him or his crows. Morty awkwardly came to see Rick for the first time since he left, and the whole interaction is very shallow, and Rick basically just shoos Morty off. I thought the funniest part of this episode is how Rick got his own anime theme song. Anyways, Rick is again encountered by Morty, however this time he is 40 years old. Yeah, this is definitely one of the roughest looks Morty has had, and Morty tells Rick that Jerry got sick with cancer, and Summer is now married. Morty begs Rick to come home, but Rick ignores him though and goes back with his crows. Sadly for Rick, he discovers that his crows were actually using him as a rebound, and they have been adventuring with Rick's new nemesis longer than he had. So of course the whole crow thing lost all meaning to Rick, and he goes back home to live with the Smith family. But what's this? Jerry is still alive, and Morty actually just used aging serum from the Citadel of Ricks. Rick excitedly brings Morty to the new Citadel, where they bring Morty back to his normal 14-year-old self. To Rick's dissatisfaction, the brand new Morty president of the Citadel asked to have dinner with Rick and Morty. He also pardoned Rick for his crimes against the Citadel. Up until this point, the episode was more or less what you expect from Rick and Morty, but once they met with the Morty president, that's the moment the episode derailed and the show moved with it. So the president almost immediately asked Rick for details about the central finite curve, and prior to this scene, the whole concept of the curve was very gatekept and only mentioned once or twice, if even. However, it turned out Rick had all of the knowledge on the central finite curve, and that's exactly what President Morty, who of course was evil Morty the whole time, wanted from Rick. He scanned Rick's brain, building off of what he had already done way earlier in the series to have a drive with all of Rick's downloaded memories. Rick, being the smartest person in the universe and the rickest Rick of them all, easily escapes from evil Morty's traps and tried to put a stop to whatever evil Morty had planned. The entire Citadel erupted into chaos, and Rick's and Morty's were being killed left and right, and all our Morty wanted from Rick was answers. Rick told him to wait, but Morty couldn't control himself, and that's when everything that we knew about Rick was finally real. Morty used the scanned memory of Rick to see his full backstory, finally confirming the majority of his original backstory in a complete one. When Morty comes back to, him and Rick confront evil Morty, who explains his full plan to the both of them. He says that he isn't truly evil unless you consider being tired of Rick to be evil. So just as the Citadel collapses, evil Morty leaves the central finite curve itself, and Rick and Morty take the surviving Mortys out of the wreck into safety. Now it is worth noting that this is technically a 3-episode arc because the season 6 premiere continues a lot of this story. However, it doesn't break the mold the same way that Rick Mariah Jack did, and it's just built in the new world that was set up by Rick Mariah Jack. This episode is the single most important episode in the show, and people tend to look over it. When we first saw a version of Rick's backstory, it felt real, but after the reveal that it was fake, it left fans with more unanswered questions than before. And the show didn't revisit the concept for 4 long years, meaning for a good chunk of the show, we knew extremely little about the inner thoughts and feelings of Rick. Because of that, Rick was a character that fans could enjoy, but they were missing the link that allows them to fully relate to Rick on an emotional level. From Rick Mariah Jack on, Rick became much more open to everyone, including the audience. Now, instead of being the unserious guy to come in and tell a joke to break up tension, Rick became an incredibly complex but now understandable character. This is why so many people liked autoerotic assimilation. In the course of an episode, Rick falls in love again, gets in over his head, and becomes severely depressed after being broken up with. Rick showed real meaningful emotions that you typically don't see from him. And instead of just repeating this plot for another episode, they applied it to the entire show's future. We didn't just see Rick go through a tough breakup, instead we watched him process losing his entire life and being hollow on the inside, filling his life with whatever meaning he can get. And by adding such depth to Rick, the show itself began to transition as well. When heading to the Citadel in the episode to begin with, Rick already opposed the fact that the Citadel runs on canon, and he said he'd much rather go on simple adventures with Morty. However, after this, none of their adventures would be the same because it is now different no matter what. In Solar Rick's, which is literally the next part of this arc, Morty finally finds out that Rick isn't his actual grandpa, a huge revelation that changes their whole dynamic that wouldn't have been possible without the events of Rick Mariah Jack. If you have enjoyed the video so far, please consider subscribing to my channel or hyping the video. It really helps and it means a lot. Season 6 also had a reoccurring problem of Rick having to deal with the large rift caused by evil Morty at the end of Season 5. It takes Rick an entire 6 episodes to even get portal travel back to what it was, and that was something completely different for the show. The consequences of one episode loomed on for the majority of the season, and continuity was becoming less of a pipe dream for Rick and Morty and far more of a reality. More episodes from Season 6 and beyond were story-driven and relied on canon, but this time the Citadel was no longer needed. Originally, evil Morty and Rick Prime were the only 2 characters that brought canon episodes, but in early episodes about them, it was always linked to the Citadel. After the destruction of the Citadel, it was almost like the pocket of continuity it held over the show was finally released. Every season since 5 has had at least 2 episodes incredibly story heavy that don't hinge off the Citadel anymore. In order to make more of the episodes that fans love, they had to phase out a place that they loved just as much. The Citadel was a great hub for creativity, but it didn't really allow Rick and Morty to grow as a show. In its final appearance, we saw its true origins, but also another secret that it was hiding that also changed the show. The central finite curve was a very unique concept, but it also came with a lot of problems. Even though it was mentioned in prior seasons, it wasn't really given a purpose until the moment it was destroyed. The existence of the dimensions on the curve don't really make sense since we've seen plenty of dimensions where their Rick is either incompetent or dead. So shouldn't those dimensions be no longer a part of the curve? Well, no matter how the curve actually worked, it doesn't matter because it's now gone, and that opens a new realm of possibilities for the show. We already saw what it looked like for evil Morty to explore life outside of the curve, and I think that there's a lot that Rick can learn from and see for himself, and even though he hasn't ventured out into it yet, I feel like that's definitely something that would make a good finale for an upcoming season. I think since evil Morty and our Rick and Morty have come in contact with each other again, and more recently worked together, the show itself has become more enjoyable. When Rick didn't know where evil Morty was, it was very hard to make episodes about him, despite him being such a popular character. But now there's infinite possibilities on what they can do with evil Morty's character. Episodes since Rick, Morty, Jack are so much better written because of the new direction of the show, and how the characters changed overnight. The average new Rick and Morty episode has definitely been a lot better than what we were getting before Rick, Morty, Jack cracked the entire show wide open, and I think it will continue that way. Besides the impact that the episode would go on to have, it's still such a good and underrated episode at face value. All the visuals are such a nice touch, and I really wish that we could have seen more of this anti-hero type of Rick, especially him in this cool cyberpunk crow stuff. And it's pretty funny Rick ended up doing this because he literally pointed out in the season 5 premiere how cliche it was for people to use cyberpunk bird styles.
God, why does everyone go cyberpunk bird?
Anyways, I think this episode was not only really great, but it also affected the show like no other episode has before. And even if it's not the flashiest or most popular of episodes, it stands alone on a different level of importance. For better or worse, after Rick, Morty, Jack, Rick and Morty could never go back to being the same show.